The ocean used to be their domain. In the dark depths far below the reach of sunlight, Japanese submariners once felt a quiet confidence. The vast Pacific had been their shield, their hunting ground, their silent ally. For years, silence meant safety. If no one could hear them, no one could find them. But on that day, as the dull hum of sonar pulsed through the water, the crew realized the silence had been broken, not by their own machines, but by something they could not control. The sonar buoy was small, almost insignificant in appearance when they intercepted its signal, but the sound it emitted told a different story. It was precise, rhythmic, alien. It sliced through the layers of seawater like a blade, and with every echo, it was as if someone else was breathing down their neck. For the men aboard the submarine, the ocean no longer felt infinite. It felt occupied. The captain moved quietly through the control room, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. He'd spent years mastering the art of stealth. To him, the ocean was a chessboard. You moved unseen, unheard, always a step ahead. But now the Americans had changed the rules of the game. The crew huddled around the hydrophone operator, watching the thin line on the monitor twitch in sync with the pings. Each sound was a reminder that the unseen enemy above knew exactly where to look. It wasn't just the sound itself that unnerved them. It was the realization that this new technology, the sonar buoy, could make their most prized weapon, their stealth, useless. For months, whispers had traveled through the fleet, rumors of American advances in anti-submarine warfare. Air dropped sonar buoys that could turn the sea into a transparent pane of glass. Systems so sensitive they could pick up a propeller turning miles away. The captain had dismissed much of it as exaggerated, perhaps even psychological warfare. But now the sound in the control room proved otherwise. Outside, the water pressed against the hull with that familiar, suffocating weight. The Pacific was vast, but the submarine felt small, almost fragile. Every creak of the metal, every pulse of the engine seemed deafening. The captain ordered the engines cut. The vessel slowed to a crawl. The men held their breath, as if their silence could make the ship disappear. But the pings continued, calm, relentless. In that moment, something shifted among the crew. A quiet panic settled over them, not wild or chaotic, but heavy, like fog creeping in through unseen cracks. This wasn't an enemy they could fight with torpedoes. This was an enemy that could hear them, track them, anticipate their every move. The hydrophone operator, a young man barely in his 20s, pressed the headset to his ears. He whispered, almost involuntarily, "They know we're here." It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a confession. The captain didn't correct him. Above them, unseen, American aircraft hovered like patient hunters. Each buoy they dropped expanded an invisible net. The once limitless ocean was turning into a cage. In the captain's mind, he replayed every maneuver, every trick submariners had used for years to evade detection. Silent running, depth changes, thermal layers. Tricks that had always worked before. But this was different. The Americans weren't searching blindly anymore. They were listening with precision. The sound of the buoy wasn't loud, but it was mercilessly steady. Ping, 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 a metronome of control. A reminder that technology had begun to tip the scales of war. The captain leaned over the plotting table. His officers waited, tension crackling between them. They needed a decision. Run, hide, or fight. Running was dangerous. They'd be louder. Hiding might not work anymore. Fighting would be suicide. A submarine was a hunter, not a fortress. He made his decision. Would dive deeper, he said, his voice calm but threaded with steel. Below the layer. The engines whispered back to life, barely audible. The submarine sank lower into colder, denser water. For decades, submariners had trusted the ocean's natural thermal layers to bend sound and conceal them. It was a game of physics and patience. If the Americans' sonar couldn't penetrate below the layer, they might slip awake. For a moment, it seemed to work. The pings grew softer, distant. A breath of relief passed through the control room like wind through leaves. The men dared to believe that the old trick still had power. But then, the pings changed. Not louder, sharper. Adjusted. As if the Americans were listening not just to the submarine, but to the ocean itself, learning it, adapting to it. The hydrophone operator raised his hand, signaling. The captain's heart sank. The Americans were following them below the layer. In that quiet steel tube, hundreds of meters below the surface, the illusion cracked. The ocean was no longer their ally. It belonged to someone else now. Someone who had turned it into a battlefield of mathematics, algorithms, and precision listening. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. For much of the war, submarines had moved like ghosts, stalking convoys, striking unseen, then disappearing into the abyss. It was a terrifying power, a power that had once belonged to them. But the Americans had grown tired of being hunted. They had built machines to hunt the hunters. The captain looked at the faces around him. Men he had trained with, laughed with, trusted with his life. They were still soldiers, still capable, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. This was not fear of death, it was fear of irrelevance, fear of becoming prey. Another ping echoed through the hull. Louder. The net was tightening. The captain clenched his fists behind his back, refusing to let his crew see doubt. But in his chest, a realization burned cold. The Americans were not just ahead in technology. They were rewriting the rules of underwater warfare in real time. And for the first time, the Japanese submarine force was on the wrong side of history. He whispered a single word, barely audible to anyone but himself. Impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was inevitable. The war had entered a new phase. Machines were now deciding what the ocean would reveal and what it would hide. Far above, an aircraft banked slowly, dropping another buoy. A small splash. Another circle of sound spread through the water. The submarine was surrounded by a soundscape it could no longer control. Every move they made would be heard. Every breath, every turn recorded. And for the men inside, it was like being watched by something they could never see. The captain finally gave the order. Prepare to turn. Silent run. The helmsman nodded, sweat glistening on his brow. The submarine began its slow, agonizing arc. Every man in the control room felt the weight of that sound. Ping, 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 closing in. This was no longer the deep, dark sanctuary they had once trusted. This was an arena where every secret was being stripped away, one echo at a time. And as they slipped deeper into the Pacific, the captain understood something he had never allowed himself to believe. The ocean was no longer theirs. The second ping was different, sharper. Closer. Like a knock on a door that no one wanted to answer. Down in the control room, the air seemed to get heavier. No one spoke. The crew knew that any sound, even their voices, could feel louder than it should in a moment like this. The ocean wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. And the sound of those sonar buoys felt like someone tapping their finger against the hull, counting down the seconds before the inevitable. The captain leaned closer to the sonar station, eyes flicking between the glowing dials and the young operator's face. He could see the beads of sweat gathering on the boy's forehead, the twitch in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand. He was young, but he didn't need to be told what was happening. The Americans weren't searching anymore. They were tracking. The difference between the two was everything. Searching meant they didn't know where you were. Tracking meant they did. The submarine shifted deeper into the thermal layer, engines purring softly, barely moving. Every maneuver was like threading a needle blindfolded. The captain knew he couldn't run forever. The buoys were too many, their coverage too wide. It was like being in the dark while someone else had a flashlight. In the galley, men sat in silence, clutching metal cups, staring at the floor. Even the usual nervous laughter had disappeared. They could hear the faint vibrations through the steel floor. The same pulse, the same metronome from above. It crept into their bones. The cook, a quiet man who usually hummed old songs during tense dives, simply stared at the kettle as steam rose and condensed against the ceiling. There was no music this time, only the sound of their beating hearts, and the pinging outside. The captain returned to the plotting table. A crude map spread across it, covered in pencil marks and grease smudges. He had circled their current position, plotted the buoy drops, tried to predict where the Americans would move next. But every calculation led to the same conclusion. The net was tightening with mathematical precision. He hated that word. Precision. It didn't belong in war, not the kind he had been trained to fight. War had always been about intuition, about reading the enemy, about the quiet skill of outsmarting someone who was trying to do the same to you. But this was different. The Americans didn't need to outsmart anyone. Their machines did the work. He thought of the stories he'd heard from other captains, whispered rumors of submarines that had vanished without firing a shot. Not sunk by depth charges, not caught in ambushes but erased, tracked, cornered, and silenced before they could even strike. The Americans didn't just hunt, they suffocated. Another ping, louder now. The crew knew that sound. It wasn't just a buoy anymore. It was aircraft above, circling like vultures. They couldn't see it, but they could imagine the metal shape, the steady engines, the men looking down through instruments, seeing what they could not. The captain made a quick calculation. He had one advantage left: the ocean's depth. The submarine could descend further than the buoy's range, maybe. It was a gamble, but war was nothing but gambles strung together with hope. He gave the order to descend. The hull creaked as the pressure increased. The lights dimmed, as if the ocean itself was squeezing the life out of them. The men braced silently, fingers gripping the cold steel rails. They knew the risks. One wrong move, one mechanical failure, and the pressure would crush them like paper. But the captain trusted the boat. He always had. It had been their shield, their weapon, their home. The pings faded slightly. For the first time in hours, hope flickered like a candle in the dark. Maybe they could slip beneath the net. Maybe the Americans hadn't accounted for their exact depth. Maybe the ocean still had secrets left to give. Then the ping shifted again. Not louder. Smarter. It was the moment everyone on board felt their stomachs drop. The Americans had recalibrated. Their machines were not static. They adapted. Like a predator learning how its prey moved. The captain stared at the plotting table again. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. If he kept running deeper, he'd reach crush depth eventually. If he stayed where he was, the Americans would tighten their grip. If he tried to surface, they'd be waiting. And then came the sound no one wanted to hear. A second buoy, then a third. Each one expanding the invisible cage. Above them, unseen, the enemy aircraft coordinated their movements with ruthless efficiency. Each splash of a new buoy was like another iron bar slamming into place. The young hydrophone operator's voice cracked slightly when he spoke. 3 contacts. All active. The captain gave a single nod. He didn't scold him for the tremor in his voice. There was no point pretending anymore. Everyone in the room felt the same thing. It wasn't just the danger that terrified them. It was the precision of it. The ocean had always been unpredictable, chaotic, a place where even the strongest navies could get lost. But the Americans were making it predictable. They were removing the one thing submariners had relied on more than anything else: uncertainty. The captain leaned closer to the microphone, giving the order for the engines to stop completely. The boat settled into a dead stillness. He was trying to make them disappear again, to let the sea swallow them. But the pings didn't care. They kept coming, steady as a heartbeat. He closed his eyes. This was what defeat sounded like. Not gunfire, not explosions, just a sound. Ping, ping, ping. He thought of the past, of the missions where they had moved like ghosts through the night, where Allied convoys had never known what hit them. He remembered the feeling of power, the quiet triumph of slipping away unseen. It had been their ocean then. They were the hunters. But now, above him, the enemy had grown into something else entirely. Technology didn't get tired. It didn't doubt. It didn't fear. The captain forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. He couldn't let his men see the storm inside his head. If he faltered, they would break, and breaking wasn't an option. He gave a new order: turn 5 degrees starboard. A tiny move, almost imperceptible, meant to create just enough confusion in the pattern. They slid silently through the black water. For a few seconds the pings seemed offbeat. Maybe it was working. Maybe they'd found a small crack in the net. But then the third buoy adjusted too. It wasn't a net anymore. It was a mind, and it was learning. One of the engineers whispered under his breath, "It's like it's alive." The captain didn't answer, but he understood the feeling. The Americans weren't just dropping machines into the water. They were turning the ocean into a sensor. They were merging the environment with their strategy, turning silence itself into their ally. Every trick in the book, depth, speed, silence, was becoming obsolete, and for the first time in his long career, the captain wondered if the ocean could truly hide anything anymore. The crew waited for the next sound. It came. Closer. A slow dread filled the submarine like cold water. There was no screaming, no panic. Just the quiet, resigned knowledge that something vast and unstoppable was unfolding above them. The captain's voice finally broke the silence. Prepare to maneuver. They weren't done fighting, not yet, but deep down, each man knew the truth. They weren't the hunters anymore. The pings were closer now. No longer distant echoes, but sharp pulses that seemed to vibrate through the bones of the submarine itself. The sound was inescapable. It filled every corridor, every compartment, as if the sea itself had chosen sides. The captain stood at the plotting table, his hands resting lightly on the edge. On the surface he was calm, but behind his eyes, a storm was brewing. He knew the moment they were in wasn't just dangerous, it was historic. The ocean, which for years had been their greatest weapon, was now a weapon turned against them. The hydrophone operator flinched at another ping. He didn't have to speak. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew it was closer. The Americans had them, not fully, not yet, but enough to make every second feel like a countdown. The captain walked slowly through the control room, his boots making barely a sound on the steel floor. He glanced at the men, each one focused on their stations, their faces pale in the dim red light. They were trained, disciplined, and loyal. But they were human, and humans can feel when the world is shifting beneath their feet. A whisper rippled through the submarine, passed between engineers and torpedo men like a silent current. It wasn't fear of dying. Death had always been a possibility. It was something deeper. The realization that the Americans had changed the rules so completely that their old skills, their hard-earned mastery of silence and depth, were losing their meaning. The captain turned to the helmsman. Port, 10 degrees. Silent. The submarine inched through the cold water. A maneuver meant to slip between the arcs of detection, a dance submariners had perfected for years. It should have worked, it always had before. But the sonar buoy didn't miss a beat. Ping. Adjust. Ping. Adjust again. The Americans were moving with them. The helmsman's jaw tightened. The captain could see the question in his eyes, even though the man didn't dare speak it aloud. How do you fight something that can hear everything? In the aft compartment, one of the younger crewmen gripped a metal rail until his knuckles went white. The vibrations through the hull felt like a predator's footsteps on the floor above. He imagined the planes overhead, their pilots relaxed, confident, watching lines and signals converge on a small dot in the vast blue below. That dot was them. The captain returned to the sonar station. Range. Close. Very close. The operator's voice was flat, emotionless now. A man who knew what was coming. Above them, more buoys hit the water. Each splash was a sound the submarine couldn't hear directly, but they all knew what it meant. Another eye. Another ear. Another piece of the cage closing in. The captain took a slow breath. He had fought many battles, but this wasn't a battle. This was a hunt, and they were the prey. He thought of the doctrines he had studied years earlier. How submarines had been the shadow force of the war, slipping beneath convoys, turning the tide with stealth and surprise. Back then, sonar had been crude. Detection had been imperfect. A clever captain could still outwit the enemy. But the Americans had invested in something different. Not brute force, not more ships. More intelligence, more listening. The pings grew more frequent, they weren't random anymore. They were coordinated. The captain knew what that meant. The aircraft overhead weren't just dropping buoys randomly. They were triangulating, pinning them down with the accuracy of a map drawn in real time. The engineering officer stepped closer. What can try to surface at nightfall? The captain shook his head. Surfacing meant death. Above them, aircraft waited like hawks. Their location wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a set of coordinates on someone's chart. Another idea was whispered. Crash dive deeper. Beyond the limits of the buoys. Beyond where the Americans expected them to go. It was dangerous. The hull was already creaking. But it was the last wild card they had. The captain made his decision. Take her down. The engines came alive with the softest hum they could manage. The submarine tilted downward, slicing deeper into the darkness. The pressure rose. Every man on board could feel it in their ears, in their chests, like the ocean itself was pressing its weight against them. The sonar operator listened. The pings grew softer, then distant, then almost gone. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing. It spread like a ripple through the room. Maybe they'd done it. Maybe they'd found a pocket the boys couldn't reach. The captain didn't smile. He knew better than to trust hope too early. The minutes ticked by like hours, then a new sound. A lower frequency, a different ping. The Americans had switched modes. Their technology reached deeper than they'd imagined. A collective shiver passed through the crew. The captain looked at the depth gauge. They couldn't go much farther. One more push and the hull would start to deform. It wasn't fear that stopped him from going deeper. It was the knowledge that the sea itself had limits, and they had reached them. For the first time, he felt something he had never felt on patrol before. Helplessness. The Americans weren't just finding them, they were hurting them. Like shepherds guiding prey toward a trap. A sharp sound echoed through the sub, not a ping but the faint rush of water above. Torpedo or depth charge preparation. The Americans were positioning. They didn't need to guess. They already knew where the submarine was. The captain gripped the edge of the plotting table. His knuckles whitened. He could feel every eye in the room turning to him, silently asking what he would do next. He looked at the chart one last time. Every option was worse than the last. But he had a duty to fight, not just to survive. He gave the order to ready torpedoes. Not because they expected to hit anything, but because they would not go down without a sound. The crew moved quickly, silently, hands steady despite the pounding of their hearts. The pings were everywhere now. A storm of sound. No matter where they turned, the ocean echoed it back. The captain whispered under his breath, not for anyone to hear. This was our ocean. And then he straightened his back. Even in defeat, he would not let the crew see fear. The helmsman called out quietly, depth holding, torpedoes ready. Above them, aircraft engines hummed faintly through the water. The Americans were patient. They could afford to be. Their machines did the work for them. The captain gave a quiet nod. Fire one. The torpedo slid from its tube into the darkness, leaving only a hollow echo behind. It surged upward, cutting through the layers, a single, desperate act in a war they no longer controlled. The crew listened. Seconds passed. Then, a distant explosion. Not a hit. Just the sound of resistance against an enemy they couldn't see. More buoys hit the water. The ocean was crowded now, filled with invisible ears. The captain knew the end when he heard it. The next sound wasn't a ping. It was the distinct, muffled crack of an approaching depth charge. No one screamed. No one panicked. They all knew what it meant. The ocean had changed hands. For years they had been the silent predators beneath the waves. But tonight, as the Americans tightened the circle, the captain finally accepted what had been clear since the first ping. The ocean was no longer theirs, and no amount of skill, bravery, or silence could change that.